Good afternoon. This hearing will now come to order. As the hearing is fully virtual, we must address a few housekeeping matters. For today's meeting, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participants' microphones when they are not under recognition for the purposes of eliminating inadvertent background noise. Members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. If I notice when you are recognized, that you have not unmuted yourself, I'll ask the staff to send you a request to unmute yourself. Please then accept that request so you are no longer muted. I remind all members and witnesses that the 5-minute clock still applies. If there's a technology issue, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved and you will retain the balance of your time. You'll notice a clock on your screen that will show how much time is remaining. At 1 minute remaining, the clock will turn to yellow. At 30 seconds remaining, I will gently tap the gavel to remind members that their time is almost expired. When your time is expired, the clock will turn red and I will begin to recognize the next member. In terms of speaking order, we will follow the order set forth in House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member. Then members present at the time the hearing is called to order will be recognized in order of seniority. And finally, members not present at the time the hearing is called to order. Finally, House rules require me to remind you that we have set up an email address to which members can send anything they wish to submit in writing at any of our hearings or markups. That email address has been provided in advance to your staff. Okay, now we can go ahead. I'd like to welcome to the subcommittee the 20th Chief of the USDA Forest Service, Randy Moore. We're so pleased to have the chance to talk with you today and hear your thoughts on the fiscal 2023 budget request for the Forest Service. Joining the chief today is Andrea Weeks, Acting Director of Strategic Planning, Budget, and Accountability. Our hearing today will address the President's 2023 budget request for the USDA Forest Service. I'm pleased to see investments included for climate science and the promotion of healthy forests. The budget request includes items such as $320 million for hazardous fuel projects, an increase of $134 million over the 2022 enacted level, $2.18 billion for the National Forest System, an increase of $314 million over the 2022 enacted level, and $76 million for research and development programs, an increase of $26 million over enacted. These investments will build upon the fiscal year 2022 investments this subcommittee secured, including a significant increase for wildland fire management funding to allow for the implementation of the new federal $15 per hour minimum wage for firefighters. Also included a historic investment of $28 million in the Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program, doubling the funding for this program to promote collaboration and foster local investment in our forest communities across the country. An increase of $35 million for forest and rangeland research, both to fuel essential research that underpins all the services work, and for staff for inventory and analysis work, which provides the framework necessary for carbon accounting on the national forest land, and the reinstatement of the legacy roads and trails line item to emphasize the importance of roads and trail remediation work that helps threatened species and improves water quality. From creating economic development in rural communities to reducing extreme heat in urban areas, healthy forests are essential to our nation. Moreover, forests across the country are a crucial part of our fight against climate change. One of the largest obstacles to healthy forests and long-term carbon sequestration is the increase of high-intensity wildfires, which are affecting our landscapes. I'm concerned to see that this year looks like it will be another severe year for wildfires. The committee has provided significant investments to prevent, combat, and recover from these wildfires in recent years, while the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act has further provided supplementary funding for these activities. I know more needs to be done. I'll look forward to discussing the impact these investments will have and where any gaps in our response may still remain. I'd now like to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Joyce, for his opening remarks.
Thank you for yielding, Chair Pingree, and for holding today's hearing. I look forward to partnering with you and our colleagues on the subcommittee as we begin our work in the fiscal year 2023 budget. I am pleased we are joined today by the 20th Chief of the U.S. Forest Service, Randy Moore, and Ms. Weeks. Chief Moore, congratulations on your appointment and welcome to your first hearing before the subcommittee. We're a tough crowd. I have no doubt that your long career at the Forest Service will be serve the nation and our forests and grasslands well. You bring a unique perspective to the chief role since you previously served as a regional forester in both the Pacific Southwest region and the Eastern region. I look forward to hearing your perspective on the Forest Service planned investments and goals for the upcoming fiscal year and how these reasonably build on the funding Congress provided in 2022. For FY23, the requests asked for an additional $1.04 billion in base Forest Service funding, nearly a 20% increase over enacted level. While I was proud of the key investments Congress provided for the Forest Service in FY22 to protect and manage our nation's forests and support our wildland firefighters, I have serious concerns about the scale of increases proposed in the President's request this year. As the nation faces record inflation, we must be extremely cognizant of the financial decisions we are making as to not saddle our future generations with unnecessary economic burdens and debt. Like all Americans, the federal government must live within its means, and doing so will require us to make difficult choices and discern wants from actual needs. Chief Moore, while it will be financially difficult to provide the Forest Service full request, I look forward to working with Chair Pingree and our colleagues to ensure the agency has the resources it needs to carry out its important mission. I was pleased to see that the wildland fire management continues to be a top priority for the agency in FY23. The request includes significant funding to support our wildland firefighters, aviation resources, and high priority hazardous fuels and forest resilience projects. While fire investments are critical, we cannot forget that we must also provide the resources and flexibilities for the fire service to actively manage and treat our nation's forests. Proactive forest management is key to improving wildlife habitat, making our forests more resilient to diseases and invasive species, and mitigating the risk and skyrocketing costs of catastrophic wildfires. And perhaps now more than ever, forest management is a critical tool to protecting the long-term vitality of one of our nation's most valued domestic natural resources, ensuring we do not need to rely on foreign countries for wood products. Chief Moore, given your time as regional forester for the Eastern region, it probably comes as no surprise to you that I'm also interested in discussing how the FY23 request supports state and private forestry programs. The urban and community forestry, forest health management, and forest stewardship programs are critical in my home state of Ohio and other states across the Eastern region, where a large percent of forest land is privately owned and urban forests are prevalent. While I know some slight reductions to these programs, I look forward to working with my colleagues to ensure that they receive the attention and the resources they deserve. State and private forestry funds are crucial to keeping our state and private forests protected and healthy and our forest canopies robust so that they can continue to provide communities with clean air and water, recreational opportunities, mineral and energy resources, and jobs. Today, we are also interested in hearing about the Forest Service ongoing work with the Great American Outdoors Act. As the agency prepares for a third year of GAOA funding, it would be good to understand how these investments have helped the Forest Service make strides in conserving public lands, tackling maintenance backlogs, and increasing visitor access and recreational opportunities, and where potential roadblocks might exist. And finally, it'd be good to discuss the Forest Service plans for implementing the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which provided billions of dollars in advance appropriations for the Forest Service. Over the coming years, we intend to engage in active oversight of the spending of those funds to secure that there's a value for the taxpayer and our natural resources without waste, fraud, and abuse. Chief Moore, thank you again for joining us this afternoon. Your stewardship of the Forest Service is important to our environment and communities across the U.S., and we wish you all the best in this role. I look forward to our discussion and working with you. Thank you again, Chair Pingree. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce, very much for your statement. And Chief Moore, you can see we're very excited to have you at our committee today, and we'd love to hear your opening remarks.
Great. So Chair Pingree, Ranking Member Joyce, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify before you today. You know, as I close in on my first year as chief, I appreciate the opportunity to provide an overview of the benefits that the Forest Service delivers to the American people and the outcomes we plan to achieve with the resources provided in this proposed fiscal year 23 budget. The bottom line for the Forest Service is in our motto, caring for the land and serving people. It's really what we're about. Our job is to sustain healthy, resilient landscapes for current and future generations. The national forests and grasslands cover about 193 million acres in 43 different states, including Puerto Rico. They are the source of drinking water for more than 60 million people living in 3,400 communities across 36 states. In 2020, the National Forest System supported more than 370,000 jobs and contributed more than $35 billion to the GDP. But the benefits that Americans get from their forests and grasslands are now at risk. The risks include wildfire crisis facing the nation and the impacts of our changing climate. The Forest Service is squarely facing these risks. Improving the conditions that we're seeing will require sound science, sustained resources, the use of all the tools in our toolbox, a robust workforce, hard work, and collaboration with our partners. I appreciate the confidence that Congress has demonstrated in the Forest Service with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. These funds, coupled with the FY23 budget request, will help restore the long-term health and resilience of the nation's forests and grasslands. The Forest Service's FY23 discretionary budget request is $9 billion. Working with our partners, we will improve the resilience of landscapes and watersheds across boundaries and reduce wildfire risk by treating the right acres at the right scale. We will restore infrastructure, support outdoor recreation, and invest in reforested landscapes that have been ravaged by wildfires, storms, and other events. The wildfire crisis has been building for decades, as you know, but we now have the science and tools to implement projects that will truly make a difference. The budget, as you indicated, dedicates about $321 million for hazardous fuels. This will support about 308 million acres of hazard reduction treatment projects. This investment supports the agency's 10-year strategy to confront the nation's wildfire crisis. At the same time, we're preparing for another long and arduous fire year, made worse by a continuing severe drought across the West. Our priority is to protect the health, safety, and well-being of the fire management community and the public we serve. The budget dedicates $1 billion to wildland fire management salaries and expenses. This investment will enable us to pay all firefighters at least $15 an hour, fund more than 300 additional firefighters and support personnel, and support resilient and mental health programs. But we need to find a permanent solution to increase in our firefighters' pay and make other system changes to ensure firefighting is a career that others will pursue in the future. And I want to work with you on that. Climate change is altering ecosystems nationwide. It has amplified impacts of fire, disease, insects, and invasive species, and is shrinking our habitat for our native plants and wildlife. The FY23 budget builds on the climate change investments contained in the FY22 budget. Our FY23 budget request of $318 million for forested rangeland research will continue our work in addressing the climate change and other critical research needs. Our infrastructure needs are pressing, as are our economic needs of Americans. The FY23 budget request stimulates construction and maintenance activities in national, regional, and local economies. We're grateful for the Great Outdoor American Act funds. That helps stabilize our $6.3 billion maintenance backlog. The national forests and grasslands belong to every American. They encompass ancestral lands, tribal territories. Every person should feel a personal invitation and connection to these lands. The Forest Service is addressing equity by ensuring that historically underserved groups can more fully access and participate in agency programs and services. We've taken significant steps to improve policies, accountability, and training to ensure a work environment that is equitable, respectful, and free from harassments of any kind. So in closing, we know what's at stake if we don't address the wildfire crisis. The health of our communities, the clean water, the camping trips, the wood products, jobs that Americans depend on for the national forests and grasslands to provide. The risk of facing these lands are significant and growing. That's why we need to act now. We need to act together and act with dedication to meet the challenges before us with sound science as our guide. So we're all in, we're ready to serve, and we've been here since 1905. Again, thank you. I'm grateful to you all for your interest and support, and I look forward to any questions that you may have.
Thank you so much, Chief Moore, for your testimony. We really appreciate the years of experience you bring to this job and look forward to working with you going into the future. I'll start the questioning with my own questions, and I'm going to jump right into some of the issues related to wood innovation. It's an important topic in my home state of Maine, and certainly in many others as we look forward to new and innovative wood products. We held a hearing on this topic last year and discussed the work of the Forest Products Laboratory, as well as programs such as wood innovation grants. In the subsequent House bill and FY22 enacted bill, we included milestone investments in programs that promote the use of small diameter timber and innovative wood products that utilize sustainable forestry. The FY22 bill included $12 million for the Community Wood Energy Program and $20 million for wood innovation grants and language regarding mass timber and other promising wood topics. So I'd love to hear you talk about this a little bit, and it would be great if you can cover a little bit about how these investments will be implemented and the on-the-ground effects of these investments that the public will see in rural communities, including economic development. And I'd also love it if you could include what progress has been made in the last year to expand the market and potential uses for low value and hazardous fuels type of timber, and what other challenges do you see existing as we move forward?
So Chairwoman, you know, that is really a great question. And I just had conversations just last week up in Skamania with the industry, talking about helping the Forest Service shift gears and us working together with our environmental community on what's needed based on the type of material that we have out on the National Forest and really on those landscapes to remove. You know, it's not just about saw logs anymore. It's really about low value, small diameter wood. That's what we have. That's what we have in abundance on our forest. And that is what's serving as ladder fuels and kindling for these fires that we're seeing across the landscape. So the question really is there a different way to look at utilizing material that we have to remove while we create jobs in these small rural communities where most of this is located? And can we look at wood innovation as a way to help us do that? So we're asking industry to work with us, and we're asking the environmental community to work with us. Now, the Forest Service really provides leadership on innovative wood products. And, you know, we feel that this potential is critical to the future of sustainable forest management. The market for innovative wood, really, we're looking at incentivizing forest stewardship to help keep forests as forests. So in our research and development, it's really supporting some of the largest forest management and wood research innovation in the world. And our Forest Products Lab there in Madison, Wisconsin is really serving as a hub for basic and applied research, where we coordinate the work of numerous academic, governmental, industrial, and nonprofit groups to kick off and accelerate the development of innovative forest products that will provide some economic and environmental benefits to the nation. So we are moving rapidly and looking at some of these biochar, cross-laminated timber as some of those things, looking at nanotechnology, advanced composites and advanced structural material, working with the architectural industry. So we are rapidly working with different groups to really help us make a shift from where we are to where we need to be. And actually, I'm pretty excited about the reception that we're getting, looking at different uses of this material that's really serving as kindling for these large catastrophic wildfires.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for the work that you're doing and the lab is doing. And I think we have a lot of exciting things to talk about going into the future. So I will yield back my own time and go to the ranking member for his questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I recently hosted a roundtable in my district with Interior Secretary Deb Haaland and local conservancy folks to discuss, among other issues, the benefits of turning abandoned properties into green spaces and the positive impact these areas and urban reforestation efforts can have on hard-hit communities like those on the east side of Cleveland. Chief Moore, having previously served as a regional forester overseeing the eastern region, which has the largest number of urban areas of all 9 Forest Service regions, can you take a moment to discuss the positive impacts urban reforestation has on children and their communities, the public health, and the environment?
Ranking member, thank you for that question as well. Let me start by saying when I was in the Eastern region, I created the Urban Connections program. And there was a need, just like you described, to really get into a lot of our large urban areas to not only just learn how to bring people in urban areas out to the forest, but how do we create the green space within these urban areas? And how do we take parts of a city and turn it into green spaces? And so we partnered with some of our partners in some ways, creating what we call pocket parks and green alleyways. And so when I was in the Eastern region, we had some initial starts. We started in Boston, Detroit, Minneapolis, and New York. And so that's where we started putting employees there to have education opportunities to talk about urban populations. You know, one of the things that we recognize is that urban forests are about 20% of all forests in the US, and they provide really an important opportunity to increase carbon sequestration and really look at trying to mitigate the effects of climate change. And you know, we've seen areas in large cities where there are no trees. And we know the value of trees in some of these areas cutting down on the utility bills. We also know the value of urban trees bringing birds back into the neighborhood. We know that there's a lot of peace and just in serenity and just being able to sit out under trees. We also have been working with doctors to write a prescription for a walk in the woods. And so I think it's demonstrated that there's a lot of value in this. And so the question for us, I believe, is that how do we do more of this kind of work to reach more people, to create that stewardship ethic within as well as outside these urban areas? And so we would love to work with you going forward on some ideals that you may have. But here again, we're all in on this ideal, and we have begun to put a lot of positions into these areas so that we can learn from our public in these urban areas. What is it that they're looking for? What is it that they would like to have? So we'll continue to seek opportunities to increase reforestation in urban areas and on state and tribal and private lands across the country.
And it would appear that Chair McCollum has the perfect backdrop there with all those green trees in her background. As you well know, Ohio and other Eastern region states rely heavily on the state and private forestry programs, especially urban and community forestry. Unfortunately, compared to the enacted level, the President's fiscal year 2023 budget proposes cutting urban and community forest funding. What impact would this potential funding cut have on the Forest Service's ability to build on the prior year urban and community forest efforts, address threats to urban forest health and resilience, and promote urban reforestation like we've seen working in Cleveland?
Well, I think we have some opportunities within the budgets that we have. And even though we may have a certain amount set aside for certain things, I think when we look at landscape perspectives and we look at our partners and we look at how do we bring all of our community to the table and how do we look at how we work together to do more. And so even if and even when a budget may be reduced in one program area, one budget area, the challenge is really to bring in that greater community to help leverage what we might want to do and what we might not be able to do in order to get this work done. You know, there's a rural to urban gradient. And when you look at landscape level treatments, I think we have to be inclusive. We have to look at having equity in our disadvantaged communities. We have to look across the whole spectrum and not necessarily be guided by what's in a particular budget. When you look at the direction and the guidelines and the budgets, I think in some cases we have more flexibility than what we might think that we do. And I certainly think that working with partners leverage our ability to do more of this kind of work because it's as you indicated, it's important.
Thank you, sir. I've exceeded my time, Madam Chair. I yield back what little or nothing I have left.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Joyce. And next we'll go to Chairwoman McCollum. Thank you very much for bringing some trees to our hearing today, and we'll let you proceed with your questions.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Pingree, for having today's hearing. And first and foremost, congratulations Chief Moore, the 20th Forest Service Chief. Congratulations to you. And I am singing Mr. Joyce's song here. I'm up at tree level, and the urban birds really do want your attention. So I'll be working with Mr. Joyce on that. I'd like to take just a moment to talk about the Office of International Programs on the work that you do partnering overseas to support sustainability, forest management, and the conservation of biodiversity. I've had the opportunity to travel internationally, see some of your projects in the countries you work in, the best soft power we have. You work on climate change, illegal logging, associated trade disaster assistance, to stop illegal timber harvests from even undercutting the wood production here in the U.S. So all at the same time, you're doing global conservation, saving our planet. So hats off to the work you do there. I want to talk about watersheds. So we don't put the right value on water because water is life sustaining. And, as you pointed out, 53% of the total in the U.S. starting forests, a lot of them in U.S. forests, right? So the Forest Service has a special responsibility to protect those watersheds, including the priceless watershed in the waters in Minnesota, our Boundary Waters National Canoe Wilderness Area. So I'm grateful for the Biden administration for restarting the study on the mineral withdrawal and marine watershed. I'm looking forward to seeing it as soon as possible. There's been a couple delays, but I know that we're hopeful that we'll have it in the next month or two. So I know you can't comment any further on that because the study is the study, right? But could you maybe talk a little more about what the role that you play on that, and then this role, and sometimes how you're in conflict. You're on the surface, and the BLM has the subsurface. So just talk about your role in protecting our water.
Okay, so Congressman McCollum, I think I heard most of what you were saying. I don't know if it's my system or yours, but you were coming in and out. So let me start with where you originally started talking in terms of working internationally across boundaries of the different countries. And, we participated in the past looking at going over, provided technical assistance to other countries, and we still do. What's interesting, though, is that even though we go over to provide technical assistance, we learn so much. Ecosystem services is one of those things that we have learned from other countries that we know has a place here in the U.S. And I know that wasn't your question, and we can talk about that later, but that's one of the new frontiers I think we have to explore. The other piece is really around water. And I think you would agree that water is is the most important natural resources that flows from forests. And one of the things that I found out just this past year is that the Forest Service manages the largest single source of water in the U.S., which is about 18% of the water that flows off through National Forest managed lands. That's a significant amount of water. And if you had to put a value on that water, it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. So first of all, thank you for increased funding for vegetation and watershed management in FY22 compared to FY21. And, I just make a note that in fiscal year 23, the budget requests a significant increase for that program, which I think will help us really look at supporting healthy, resilient watersheds and sustain that production of clean water that I just talked about, the 18% of the total water flowing through and off national forests. I think in FY23, our goal is to look at improving 16 watersheds in condition class 1. That's the highest level of a watershed function. So we go in and we do an assessment. We look at the existing condition of a watershed condition class 3, 2, 1, 1 being the best. And so the question, and it's rhetorical, but the question that I would lay out there is at some point, we should pursue looking at outcomes versus outputs. And the watershed condition class is a great example of how to look at outcomes of doing the work in a watershed rather than the outputs of acres treated as an example. So rather than acres treated, did we move that watershed condition class from 3 to 2 or from 2 to 1? And what does it take to do that? So I think it's just a different way of looking at how can we be responsible to Congress and how can we be responsible to the American people? And I think we need to pursue looking at outcomes a bit more.
Chief Morris,
yes.
I have to cut you off. Unless, Chair McCollum, do you want me to try to get the last question? It was a little hard to hear you on the question about the BLM and the watershed. So I'm not sure the Chief got your full question. Maybe we could put it into the second round. Yeah, I'm just gonna move on because she has a tough connection. So next we're gonna go to Mr. Stewart for your 5 minutes. And Mr. Stewart, you might be muted.
Thank you.
Yeah, she's right. Thank you.
Apologize for that. I actually pushed a button. Apparently I didn't push it hard enough.
Yeah,
Chairwoman, thank you. And
that's okay, Madam Chair.
Sorry, I think we're getting some delayed feedback from Congresswoman. Anyway, I think we're good now. So go ahead,
Okay.
please, Mr. Stewart.
All right, we'll start again. Again, Chairwoman, thank you. Chief, thanks for being with us. Thanks for your leadership on a lot of these tough issues. I think, as I recall, you were working in my neck of the woods up in the Cashew in the National Forest at some point. Is that true, Chief?
That's correct.
Well, I'm sure you miss it. We miss you. It's one of the most beautiful forests in the country, a beautiful area. Thanks for your service there. And as I look at your bio, really all around the country, you have a diverse background, and we know you'll be able to apply much of that knowledge because your problems aren't just in the West. Forest has concerns, across the country, as you've indicated here today. Hey, could I hit a couple things quickly? And I think we really can do it quickly. One of them is just to tell you thank you. My former chief of staff here in Washington, D.C. is now the director of natural resources for the state of Utah. And he wanted me to convey to you the shared stewardship and the success you've had. We feel like we've had with you in that we really has been a great partnership. And because we feel like it has worked so well, we hope you and the Forest Service agree and that you'll continue and a commitment to work together on that and solving some of these resource problems. So again, thank you. And we hope that you'll continue to work with Utah and with other directors. A concern I have, and I'll bet you do too as well, Chief, is that as you indicated, fire management is of course one of the primary things we want to talk about. As Ms. Pingree noted, it's likely this year is not going to be better than last year. In fact, it's probably going to be worse based on the drought conditions in the West. And so we've appropriated more money, but as you know, Chief, a 10-year plan, half of that money, 5 years of it, is supplemented through the infrastructure bill. And it worries me that we get to year 5 and now we have a 50% reduction. And I wondered if you could comment on that and how you think the best way to address it.
So Congressman, we have a 10-year strategy that we've developed, and we're looking at a 5-year plan. And we are so grateful for Congress for passing the infrastructure bill, because this has given us more hope than we've had in a very long time in this agency. I also want to point out, though, that as welcome as that amount of money is, we want everyone to understand this is only a down payment to try to really get at addressing the problem that we see ourselves facing in this country. And when you look at the 66 or so million acres of national forest system lands alone, not to mention the other 100 or so million acres of other private, federal, and tribal lands, you would understand that this is just not nearly enough to really get at the problem, but it is a good down payment. I think, when you look at the accountability of what Congress has done for the American people and for the Forest Service, it's up to us now to work with our partners on the accountability end. We want to demonstrate to Congress and the American people that here's what we are doing with what we have. If we had more, we'll do more. But we feel like we owe it to you to demonstrate that we can be effective and successful in trying to address this problem that we have out here, particularly on our western landscapes, but not only the western landscapes. You know, we have disease and insects, hurricanes in the east and the south. And so we have problems all across the country. But we want to demonstrate to you what we're going to do with what we have.
Well, Chief, I appreciate that. And if I could just make one suggestion, and then again, I know that you've considered this many times, but that supplemental appropriations for forest fire, which again, we know is going to be a challenge, but we hope you'll consider as well the forest management side of that, you know, rather than, you know, having fires and just appropriating money to fight the fires, to be, as I know you are, lean into that, be progressive and to be aggressive in how do we manage our forests to mitigate fires or you know, to actually decrease the likelihood that the fires spread. And again, I know you've had that conversation. Could I mention one other thing? So now two things then, Chief, keeping track for us. Shared stewardship, hope you'll work with us on that. Forest management plans to minimize the actual number of fires. And then finally, and I didn't know that I would be talking to you about this, it's kind of an unusual subject, but it's been brought to my attention that we have a bit of a bee controversy in Utah, in the sense that we've got bee owners, and I grew up farming, and we had hives on my father's farm, and we got free honey for that. That was a great deal. But we have some beehive owners and others who would love to, you know, put some of their hives on federal lands, and we feel like there's some real benefit of that in the pollinization that they would provide. But then we have some who oppose that. They say that it crowds out the natural pollinators. And I mean, I didn't know that there was bee crowding in our federal lands. In fact, I think a lot of us are fearful that, you know, our honeybees and others, there's a diminishing population. But I wonder if you could comment on that, or if that's something that, you know, we could work with you as well to maybe make that opportunity available for private bee owners who would like to, again, put hives on public lands.
I'm sorry to say, Mr. Stewart, but you've gone over your time. So Mr. Chief Moore, if you could just either answer it in writing or we'll save it for the second round.
Yeah, Chief, if you would, maybe we'll just talk to you in writing. I'm sorry, Ms. Pingree, we don't have a timer, so I have a tendency to lose track, but thank you.
They were all, you know, excellent remarks. So we appreciate your comments.
Thank you.
Mr. Gilmer, to you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Chief, thanks for being with us today. I am really grateful for the work that the Forest Service does all over our country, but I want to focus on my first and top priority, which is the Olympic National Forest. That is an ecological and economic backbone for the region that I represent. First, I want to just extend a standing invitation to you to come to our neck of the woods to see some of the challenges and some of the opportunities that we're having on the Olympic. The issues surrounding timber and the Olympic Peninsula are very personal to me. I grew up in Port Angeles. I was in high school right around the time the timber industry took it on the chin. Saw a lot of my friends' parents lose their jobs, a lot of my neighbors lose their jobs. And I am tired of watching our rural economies that depend on federal timber harvest struggle and folks lose their jobs. And we need your help. You know, for the past few years at every Forest Service budget hearing, the concern I have expressed is that the Olympic National Forest has persistently failed to produce the meaningful harvest levels that are needed to not just to support timber dependent communities, but to improve forest health and to deal with critical salmon spawning habitats as well. We have really good and really dedicated people working in our forest and in our region, but the outcomes just have not been acceptable. I have consistently asked the Forest Service, what can I do? What can this committee do to address the acute challenges at the Olympic National Forest? I know that resource limitations have impacted operations service-wide, and that's something our committee has been working to address. But we're experiencing some acute challenges on the Olympic that I could really use your help on. I honestly cannot remember the last time the ONF met its annual harvest target. We've got to do better. The timber sale target in fiscal year 21 was 20 million board feet. The actual was 6. We visited the leadership at the forest, and we were just told recently that the goal for ONF would be down the next couple of years too. So there are real concerns that we are not going to provide adequate predictable harvest. So that brings me to the opportunities. We've got the Olympic Forest Collaborative that's actually united folks from the environmental community and the timber industry around a common goal of responsibly increasing harvest levels on the ONF. And I'm proud to say that we've actually executed a few pilot projects that have helped the ONF produce a couple million additional board feet of timber, also accomplishing some important restorations goals. These projects have demonstrated the power of collaborative forest planning for meeting the goals of our region, but we need to scale up. We really need your help to achieve these benefits, especially as rural communities throughout my district continue to take it on the chin. So I want to be really clear. I am grateful for the partnership with the regional forester, Glenn Casamasa, and the ONF supervisor, Kelly Lawrence, and her team. Both share my commitment to supporting the work of the collaborative. But there's only so much we can accomplish without dedicated support and resources. So here's the questions I want to ask. One, how do you plan to support our region's efforts to increase harvest levels and forest restoration projects on the Olympic National Forest? Two, what do you need from me and from this committee to support that effort? Because we need your help. And three, what resources does the Forest Service need to help support forest collaboratives like the Olympic Forest Collaborative that don't qualify for the collaborative forest landscape restoration dollars?
Yeah. So Congressman Kilmer, first of all, I have to compliment you on how well informed you are about what's going on in that forest in your congressional district. So unlike in the past where you're correct, the Olympic National Forest only provided about 6 million board feet out of a 20 million board feet target. This year, I'll have you know that the Olympic National Forest is on track to sell approximately 18 million board feet of timber in this fiscal year. And that's really a mix of Good Neighbor Authority and other Forest Service sales. Now, the Good Neighbor Authority is one of those tools that we've been pretty proud of, and we're getting a lot of mileage out of that, particularly with our partners. And so last year they did sell about 6 million board feet out of a 20 million board feet target. My conversation with the regional forester is that they have looked at creating a plan, a 3-year plan, and it's not going to take them 3 years to do it. They're going to get it done this year, but it's a 3-year plan where they can build a pipeline of timber so that when things happen, whether there's fires or disease and insects or some of those things, then you're not, the industry doesn't suffer, because we really need industry if we're going to work our way out of this problem that we have in this country. And so it's in everyone's best interest that the industry continues to survive in this country, because it is one of the primary tools that we need to help us with this situation that we're in. So we're monitoring the Olympic. The regional forester there is well aware of your concerns. And I think that you've already had more effect than what you may realize, because they have really turned it around this year, and we are working with them to see if they can sustain this level.
Sorry, I have to cut you off, but if you want to continue that, we can do so in another round. And I'm going to move on to Mr. Cartwright.
Thank you, Chair Pingree, and thank you, Chief Moore, for being with us this afternoon. As you know, my district in northeastern Pennsylvania is the home of the first head of the National Forest Service, and that was Gifford Pinchot, who was also the 28th governor of Pennsylvania. But maybe more importantly, my district is home to a lot of forest land, including 2 state forests, Delaware State Forest and the Pinchot State Forest, which are important components of the economy and the lifestyle of the region. We also have thousands of acres of privately owned forests used for recreation, forest products, natural resource conservation. I want to talk about riparian buffers for a moment. As you know, my district is in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which is the largest estuary in the United States. And unfortunately, for decades, the Chesapeake Bay has been polluted by toxic contaminants like pesticides, pharmaceuticals, metals. And the effort to restore the bay has disproportionately fallen on the shoulders of people in my districts, people who are already struggling just to get by. Now, since joining this committee, I have fought hard to secure as much federal money as possible to help offset this local burden by helping townships in my district improve their stormwater management systems. These investments have been really important for my district, but improving stormwater infrastructure is just one of the many strategies that can be used to improve water quality in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. As you know, another way we can manage pollution in the Chesapeake Bay watershed is by restoring riparian forest buffers, which are essentially just the forests alongside a body of water. These buffers mitigate the impacts of water pollution by trapping and filtering sediment and pollutants carried by stormwater before it flows into the bay. So the question is, how do resources for riparian forest buffers requested in your FY23 budget help Chesapeake Bay watershed states like Pennsylvania meet their EPA pollution reduction mandates?
So Congressman, thank you. So we work through our state and private programs, part of the Forest Service. And the Forest Service is spearheading a riparian forest buffer initiative this spring. And it's things like webinars, reports, roundtables, and it's really culminating today with a high-level workshop that's being held. And this is for state partners to reveal their strategic action plan for riparian buffer zones. So we play a supporting role in EPA's watershed implementation plans. And this is things like helping with funding, communications, reporting, coordination on all of their forestry related goals. We've also been working with Farm Service Agency to provide grants for 12 riparian foresters in the watershed to provide additional outreach and technical assistance for these riparian buffer zones. So the riparian buffer is largely an agriculture practice for the Chesapeake Bay program, and forestry is providing the technical expertise on the forestry section of that. But we are engaged in some cases as a supporting role. Other cases we provide the Technical Institute. In other cases we provide funding to bring on the needed skills that others may need. And so we're actively engaged, sir.
Well, I thank you for that, Chief, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you very much for your question. Mr. Harder, do you have questions today?
I do. Thank you. Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for holding this hearing. And Chief, thank you so much for attending and for your incredible work. As you know, wildfires are an existential issue for communities like mine in California's Central Valley. Last year, we experienced 60 smoke days due to these wildfires, 2 months out of the year where the air was so filled with smoke that it was unsafe for our kids to play outside. I grew up with childhood asthma. I know how bad it gets out here, and these wildfires are only making the air quality situation a lot worse. And as you know, I'm a huge supporter of the incredible work our firefighters have doing to prevent and to fight these fires. And I'm concerned about the continued shortages. I know this budget request is intended to address some of those shortages, those labor shortages that we're seeing across California and the West. You've requested about $1 billion to fund hiring additional firefighters. Can you talk about what it will take to get the Forest Service fully staffed for the fire years that we're seeing right now, and what more might be necessary based on the budget request that you're seeing now?
Yeah, thank you. So Congressman Harder, I know all too well about these wildfires, particularly in California after just coming from there. You know, it's getting tougher. 99 days last year, which is a record of planning level 4 and 5. That's pretty darn significant. And so we have to do something about that. The 10-year strategy takes on a piece of that. And I think it's the main piece of how we try to get at this problem. Now, to be more specific on the question that you asked, we had planned to hire about 11,400 firefighters this year. We have brought on about 90% of that already. There's a lot of competition out there for firefighters. And so we feel like we're ready. We can make up for that 10%. We're going to do a number of things to make up for that. And we say that because we find ourselves in a situation in New Mexico and Arizona as we speak in terms of wildfires taking place there and the staffing level. Are we ready? New Mexico is into an activity level that normally happens about 4 to 6 weeks from now is that much earlier this year there, and the winds are compounding that. We plan to, look at, we have the ability to hire private contract firefighters. We have the ability to hire more what we call ADs, that's administratively determined employees. We're also looking at having some additional rounds of hiring our seasonal and permanent firefighters. And so we're going to continue to do all these things all the way up and through the year. So we are prepared at 90%. We know how to make up that 10%. And so we feel like we are a long ways toward where we want it to be, and we'll get there 100% shortly. And we do have that ability internally. I mentioned 11,400 firefighters, but we also have just a firefighting community, whether that's with other Department of Interior firefighters, state firefighters, local firefighters, and private firefighters. So we have a pretty large workforce of firefighters to call upon.
Thank you, Chief. That's very helpful. Is 11,400 the right number? Because I'm concerned that that's only a 10% increase on the forestry personnel that we've seen historically. And these wildfires aren't getting 10% worse; they're getting 10 times worse. Are you confident that that's going to be enough to really keep our community safe?
Well, let me tell you, I don't know we'll ever have enough, Congressman, unless we do something differently than what's taking place now. We have to address the vegetation situation out there on the forest, because most of these fire adapted ecosystems where you had ponderosa pine, mixed conifer, I don't want to get too detailed, but I want to just explain that most of these ecosystems that we're talking about was fire dependent. And what has happened though, like a ponderosa pine, mixed conifer per acre, they used to have about 40 to 60 trees per acre. Now that same veg type has anywhere up to 600 to 1,000 trees per acre. And so while we're talking about having enough firefighters to suppress the fires, we really need to be talking about how do we manage the vegetation out there so that when these fires do happen, it does its natural thing and it's not really destructive like it is now. And so that is a very important piece. That's what the 10-year strategy is for. But you're right, we have to put the fires out that are taking place now. And just to give you some context of the Forest Service, even though we talk about 11,400 professional full-time firefighters, the Forest Service also have a number of other firefighters that do other duties like timber, like recreation, special uses, those sorts of things. And we can call on them from anywhere across the country. Last year, we had 29,000 firefighters fighting fires primarily in the West, and it still wasn't enough. And so that's why we can have discussions about, do we have enough? And that's a valid question to ask, but we have to be really aggressive and forthright in trying to reduce the conditions that are root cause of these fires out there.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much for your question and your answers. I don't know how many members want to ask a second question, but I think a couple do. So I'm just going to start a second round, and I'll start with one topic. I'm interested in this question around the forest industry inventory. I didn't mean to say industry, forest inventory and old growth forests. The committee included a strong investment in forest inventory work in the fiscal 2022 bill, including 22 million in the program line and 216 million in forest and rangeland research salaries and expenses. And I know last week on Earth Day, the administration made a joint announcement about a plan to better catalog old growth forests. So I just want to hear you talk a little bit about how you're going to move forward on that, how you'll work with the Department of Interior to implement the executive order, what funding will be utilized for the work. Do you kind of have a roadmap for how you're going about doing it? And just any other information you can share about the scope of the initiative and also the topic of how you will define mature and old growth forests in this context.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. So we're still reviewing the language and what it means for the Forest Service. Now, we want to have a full understanding of the direction, and we want to ensure that our understanding is shared with the Department of Interior and vice versa. We believe that the executive order really outlines a science-based approach. We'll be working with DOI again here, trying to define and conduct an inventory that can be easily shared with the public. So it's framed within the context of wildfire risk. So it's critically important that we can implement the landscape scale treatments that reduce the risk to these communities, but also reduce the risk to infrastructure and also the natural resources, but at the same time, conserve our old and mature forests, which is really are important components of climate mitigation. And so we have to keep that. I think that executive order really addresses that. I think the wood products industry is also another important partner in trying to achieve this wildfire risk reduction goals. And the executive order speaks to the need for sustainable wood products industries but using a science-based approach to active forest management. So we're looking forward to working with all of the stakeholders moving forward on how we might implement that executive order to really get at the bottom line, which is create healthy, resilient forests.
Thank you for that. And we'll be anxious to just continue to have this conversation as you move forward. I'll turn to Mr. Joyce. Did you have any other questions you'd like to ask?
I certainly do. Thank you. Chief Moore, I'd like to discuss a newer issue that we've been tracking, beech leaf disease. Does it ring a bell? Okay.
Yes, I'm sorry.
And the potential destructive impact it could have in trees in Ohio, Pennsylvania, New York, and New England states. In Northeast Ohio, maple beech forests make up about 25% of the woodland, so the disease could be extremely problematic for the forest canopy, wildlife, and the ecosystem. I'm proud that groups in my district are working diligently to learn more about the disease, how it spreads, and how to potentially breed resistant trees. But as we've learned through our experience with the emerald ash borer, controlling beech leaf disease will require comprehensive work at local, state, and federal levels. Can you discuss the work the Forest Service is currently carrying out and related to the beech leaf disease, and how does FY23 request support research and research partnerships on newer diseases like the beech leaf disease?
Thank you, Congressman. So this beech leaf disease, it's we call it the BLD, and it's an emerging disease that's affecting the American beech, and it has reached across about 10 states in as many years. And so it was first detected, of course, in Ohio, and it appears to be caused by what we call the phytopathogenic nematode, and it likely came from somewhere in Asia. But we're currently conducting surveys across the range of this disease as we understand it now to try to track and understand how it's moving across the country. Like I said, 10 states in 10 years, that's pretty aggressive in our opinion. So we are also working with state partners to help us to determine the scale of this. I mean, are we missing things? Is it occurred somewhere else? So our Forest Health Protection Program has provided a number of grants to support state surveys, including Ohio, New York, and many other states. And so we are working with the state to really do some aggressive surveying to really get the extent of this problem so that we can map it. Now, we've partnered also with the Cleveland Parks and Recreation in Ohio to develop and implement what we call a reporting app, which any citizen or citizen scientist, we have different things, but any citizen scientist can really log in and delineate where they see, the beech tree and just see where we are seeing some of this. And so we think that app is going to do a really good job of helping us to identify and really help us to map out the extent of this. But we're dialed in on this issue. We have our scientists working with other science partners across particularly the East, trying to get a handle on this problem. But we feel like it's a pretty significant disease that's beginning to spread at what I would consider a rapid rate.
Well, thank you. And one last quick one. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act provided significant funding and new authorities to help mitigate catastrophic wildfires. Chief, can you provide an update on what the Forest Service is doing to expedite that funding and directives to help combat wildfires in the West?
So yes, and I don't know if we run out of time, but I can certainly give it to you in writing. But in short, we developed a strategy. We call it the 10-year strategy. It's the wildfire risk reduction strategy. We've also announced the 10 landscape that we're going to begin the work in. We're going to focus on high priority fire sheds, protecting communities and resources. We're actually funding about $171 million this year. $130 million, this year on projects that are ready to go. And so we looked at the 10 landscapes across 8 states, and we are beginning work this year on trying to reduce the fire hazard potential in these different fire sheds. So this is one of the most aggressive approaches that we've taken in a very long time. And so we've gone from developing a strategy to implementing a strategy in less than 7 months. And that's almost a record for us in terms of how quickly we've moved. But we understand the urgency of this problem. We have been doing this with our partners, and I've got to give a lot of credit to our partners. We are all in this together. We seem to be working seamlessly across many different perspectives and spectrums. And so I'm really excited about how the community of leaders and partners are coming together to address this significant issue.
And just real quickly, and add on to that, while that has been a down payment on the work that needs to be done, how much funding does the Forest Service realistically need to make a sizable dent in the backlog of forest management work?
Well, we figure, if there's another $20 billion to really get at the heart of this problem. And while that is a lot of money, when you look at the amount of money we're spending on suppression, and you look at the amount of money that we're spending on communities that have been destroyed, lives that have been turned upside down, it's really not a significant amount compared to the damage of not doing that and what it's causing to the American people.
Thank you. I yield back, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Joyce. Mr. Kilmer, do you have another question you'd like to discuss?
I do. Thanks, Madam Chair. In the first round, I asked about harvest levels in the near term. I think there's an understanding that probably the most significant impact in terms of the long term is the forest plan. So I wanted to ask about forest plan updates. The Northwest Forest Plan was, as you know, Chief, created at a time of crisis. It wasn't intended to be extended in perpetuity. It was meant to be revised over time. I think there's a sense that we've learned more over time about what works for species and what works for forest health and what's manageable from the standpoint of both economic and environmental sustainability. When I got to Congress, I asked about the plan to update the Northwest Forest Plan. I was told at that time that there would be an update in the next 5 years. That was 2013. In the fiscal year 2022 bill that the president recently signed, the committee requested the service to create a report on the current list of forest management plans requiring revision or completion, a proposed course of action, and a timeline for compliance. I guess my question is, when can we expect to receive that report? And if you have any information on the plan to update the Northwest Forest Plan, I'd sure love to hear that, or I am happy to wait for the report back from the language that we put in requesting an update.
So the FY23 budget does allow us to really address that issue, Congressman. Now I'll tell you, when I was in California, I worked with my counterpart, Glenn Casamaster there, and we were looking at being really aggressive to update the Northwest Forest Plan area. And so we had began conversations with environmental community, industry, and a lot of other partners about, looking at just the scientific literature that's out in those areas. But as you know, probably better than me, support for forest plan revision, it ebbs and flows. And so whether we're able to do that or not depends really on how that support ebbs and flows in terms of getting that work done. But we are pulling together a report of all the plans that are currently outdated. There's a significant number of them. We also are looking at finalizing our plan for how we would really go about that. And I think that once we do that, Congressman, we would love to have a conversation with Congress about what we see, what we think it will take, and get some support and perspectives from you and others as we look at trying to finalize that with the administration.
I appreciate that. And again, would just once again extend an invitation to you. We'd love to have you come out to our neck of the woods. I think folks in the Olympic would love to talk to you about some of these short-term issues and some of the long-term challenges and how we might get through them together. So would happily host you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'd love to visit.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cartwright, do you have another question you'd like to ask?
I do. Thank you, Chair Pingree. Chief Moore, I'm happy to see you've specifically added language concerning providing technical and financial assistance for invasive plants. into this state and private forest budgeting line in this year's request. You and I both know that invasive plant species can have devastating impacts. The National Recreation Area in my district, which is the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, constantly dealing with the decline in native plants and the problem of invasive species. In fact, plants like the Japanese knotweed are very difficult to eradicate, and they're all over the place. Last year, I introduced the Bipartisan Native Plant Species Pilot Program Act, and it's a bill that combats invasive species by establishing a pilot program to promote and increase the use of native plants within the National Park Service. Would a similar or analogous program be beneficial to the Forest Service?
So, Congressman, there's no question that non-native invasive species are really confounded in climate adaptation plans and forest management and conservation in general. You know, for forests to be resilient to climate change and invasive species, native tree diversity and vigor must be maintained and enhanced to the greatest extent possible. Now, our native plant material policy, which was developed back in 2008, promotes the use of genetically, and let me get that right, genetically appropriate, climate resilient native plant material for use in revegetation, restoration, and rehabilitation of native ecosystem. And so when you look at the amount of work that we need to do in terms of revegetating or reforestating these landscapes, where we need to really go in and do some work, that's going to be a really critical piece of how we do that. Now, I'll just be upfront with you. You know, I was once asked by a scientist, and you know, he asked me, he said, so, you know, the fact that you don't want to introduce non-native species into an area, does it mean that all non-natives are bad? Well, you know, that's a matter of perspective, right? I think the point that we're trying to make, though, is that in many cases, a lot of our non-native invasive species is really creating problems for us from a climate perspective, from a forest management perspective, and really from a perspective of trying to look at conservation. And so we're happy to review your legislation that you're looking at. We're happy to work with your staff to provide some comments and applicability to Forest Service lands. But I do think it's a vital and critical thing that we need to pay attention to. And again, we'd be happy to look at your legislation, sir.
I appreciate your attention to that and your offer to work with us on it, Chief Moore. Thanks very much, and thanks for your presence here today. Yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Cartwright. Mr. Harder, would you like to ask another question?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Chair Pingree, and thank you again, Chief, for being here. I wanted to ask about the hazardous fuel management money that was allocated in the infrastructure bill. I believe there was about $2.5 billion that was allocated then. We're looking for another 650 at in this budget request to consider. When you look at the 250 that was 2.5 billion that was allocated last year, how do you think about the risk reduction that has happened because of that? How do you explain the value of where we'd be if that money hadn't actually gone out? And where do you think the remaining $650 million that we're looking for in this budget request will get us?
Yeah, Congressman Harder, let's look at your state as an example. And I think it's pretty typical of many other states. Our approach has really been trying to take the dollars that we have and give everyone a little bit to try and get some work done in their areas. The problem with that, and it's happened over time, it didn't happen right away, but the problem with that is that the scale of these fires is far exceeding our current method for trying to provide restoration and resilience on these landscapes. And let me stick with California for a minute, but we have many other examples. If I look at the Caldor fire that happened last year in California, that fire started down on the El Dorado National Forest. And that fire started in an area where we had a lot of small restoration type projects around that area. We call those random acts of restoration, but we had a lot of support for the funding. What happened when the Caldor fire started, it burned right through that type of a treatment. And until it got to Lake Tahoe Basin, it did not slow down. It slowed down there for a number of reasons. One of the biggest reasons is that we had restoration treatment over time at scale. And that's further verified by looking at the fire boundary and how consistent it was with that landscape level treatment, the large scale treatments. And so I think a part of the solution going forward is not necessarily doing a lot of those small projects again, but how do we bring the community of people together to really get at making the scale of work on the ground match the scale of fires that we're seeing. And that's why we need a lot of other entities like the industry as an example, wood innovation, which the Madam Chairwoman talked about. There's a number of things that need to take place. And I think we're having an opportunity through the collaborative to bring in the environmental community, industry, and everything in between to talk about how do we move forward at that landscape scale so that we get the social license to do what we think needs to happen on the ground to stop.
Thank you, Chief. That's helpful. Just so I understand, how much of the $2.5 billion that was allocated last year has been spent, and are we on track to hit our goals, or to hit the Forest Service goals in terms of the number of acres on which the hazardous fuels have been reduced?
Yeah, and I probably didn't do a good job. So last year, our goal was to treat about 3.2 million acres with that money. Because of the fire situation and other things, we treated about 2.9 million acres. But those 2.9 million acres of the 3.2 million acres was what I'm talking about. There were small random areas of how we treated. The difference this year, looking at the additional increases to increase those small plots where we were working to large landscape type treatments, because we know that that's what's going to stop how that fire behaves as it moves across the landscapes. And so the answer is we got 2.9 million of the 3.2 we plan to. We also are looking at about 3.8 million acres in addition to what we are doing based on the infrastructure dollars. But that we'll implement that differently than what we've been doing in the past.
I guess my only question, and I know I'm running out of time, is, if we were able to hit 2.9 million acres with $2.5 billion, is an additional 650 million enough to get us where we need to be? Because that's what this budget request is, and it gives me a little bit of pause, because it seems like we might need even more support in order to make sure that we're protecting as many acres as are needed. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And not all acres are the same. There are some acres we can treat fairly reasonable. There are some areas that's going to be really expensive to treat. The closer you get into communities, the more expensive it is to treat those areas. And so I feel pretty optimistic about it. I'm happy to have a further conversation with you and others on the specific plans for how we're planning to approach the additional dollars and the work that we're doing. We'll also look at unit costs, per acre costs to put these treatments on the ground. And so we're happy to share that with you and sit down with you and answer any detailed questions you might have, Congressman.
Thank you so much, Chief. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions. Well, we really appreciate Chief Moore and Ms. Weeks that you spent the time with us today, and we had a chance to have this conversation with you. And I know we will continue to have many more as we work through the budget process. So want to appreciate your time, your testimony, and if there are no other questions, this hearing is now adjourned.
Madam.
Thanks, everybody.